Hello and welcome everyone in another episode of Researcher Celebrity. Today we have Dr. Ryan Smith with us. A brief introduction of Dr. Ryan. He has done his bachelor's at UC Riverside in biology and started the master's program. Soon he realized that he wanted to do a PhD, so he jumped from master's to PhD and completed his PhD at UC Riverside in cell molecular and developmental biology. Then he moved to Johns Hopkins for his postdoctoral term and joined as assistant professor, got the faculty position at Iowa State University in the Department of Plant Pathology, Entomology, and Microbiology. With this brief introduction, I would like to welcome Dr. Ryan and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule.
Thanks, Raja. It's a pleasure.
So we always start our conversations that how and when you decided to become a researcher.
Yeah, I don't, it's kind of a convoluted path. I never, you know, as a kid, I never envisioned, oh, I'm going to be a scientist, and that was something that came much later in life. I wanted to be a professional baseball player, then I wanted to be a doctor, and then it really wasn't until I got later into college of really thinking of research. And so, one of the things that, really stand out to me that really kind of started my interest is I always had two loves as far as academic interests. One was history, and the other was biology. And arguably, I'm probably still more passionate about history. It's something that's kind of more of a hobby. Um, but I've always really liked biology, and I've always found it to have a lot of career options. And like I said, originally it was kind of trying to maybe become a doctor or some other kind of medical degree, but it really wasn't until maybe my junior or kind of senior year of college when I really started getting in my upper division classes and it actually started doing some lab work. I kind of had an interest in potentially even field biology and starting my junior year, I'd actually taken a position working with a local museum, and I was actually doing field biology research and small mammal trapping, looking at kangaroo rats, which is an endangered species in California. Um, and I enjoyed that. That was fun, but I learned that I didn't want to be out in the field all the time. I liked a lab, and I'd always had a really strong interest in molecular biology. And with one of my upper division classes, we had to talk about this project or kind of an up and coming project in the field of molecular biology, and was kind of turned on to this idea of making transgenic mosquitoes. At the time, this was still a relatively new concept, really kind of more proof of principle experiments, but I was really fascinated by it. And as I started doing literature reviews, I realized that one of the leading researchers was at my campus and my institution, and so ultimately I came into contact with him and kind of came up with this idea of doing a master's and working with Peter Atkinson, who kind of led some of the early work, especially with the Hermes transposable element for genetic transformation of Drosophila and in mosquitoes. And so that kind of really started my path. And with that, I went off to grad school, still thinking that I was, maybe just going to get my master's and then go work for like a biotech company. I didn't have the best grades, especially at the beginning of college. Um, I struggled, I guess you could say, with the transition to college. And, in previous to college, studying was really easy. I didn't really have to study. And so there was a much greater level of dedication than I wasn't accustomed to. And so it was a big transition for me in college. And so with not having the best grades, it's also one of the reasons why I went into a master's program. And so once I got in that program, I realized that, hey, I could do this. And I actually really liked it. And, I did well in my classes. I found, I personally felt that I was kind of at the top of my peer group. And so with that, I within the first couple quarters, I transitioned into the PhD program, and that was accepted by both my boss and people in the program, and never looked back. And so about 5 years later, I received my PhD. And so, it was a little convoluted, I guess you could say, as to what got me into this path. But it's something that um, I've always had a really strong interest or spark for doing research. I find it really rewarding, and it's kind of an interesting aspect to at the time of doing an experiment. You can be the first person in the world to know something, and it could be something really small or tiny, but I think that is really kind of an interesting aspect of it. And I still um, there's certain discoveries that I've kind of made along in my career so far that it's like they stick with you kind of for through all these years of oh my gosh, this is amazing. The first transgenic mosquito I made about fell out of my chair. And I'll always remember that. And I think that having that kind of passion and love for doing this type of work, I think, is really important.
Absolutely. And this is like we have shared these conversations with researcher celebrities all over the world. And you are, absolutely on the line, although you said it is convoluted because once you choose biology as your major, the first thing everyone wants to become is a doctor.
Sure.
And that is like perfect. But as you mentioned, so the navigating the path through that at one place you have a hobby in history. So we had one of the researcher celebrity who still claims that he knows more of history less than biology, and he's a successful researcher.
Yep.
Absolutely. So I always say that you should have some hobbies which can cope up with your failed experiment. So let's talk about the journey of the PhD as then and now. When will come that now when you are mentoring all the students, how does that change? So starting with your PhD, how was that journey?
Um, some people talk about different PhD experiences. Mine was very positive. I kind of came into a welcoming lab. I think for the most part, everything, I still think I have the sheet of paper that, I sat down with my advisor, and, he kind of scratched out like an initial plan for a thesis. And I mean, that was ultimately what happened. There's a lot of people that can kind of go, different directions where, things don't work. And I can't say that what I was trying to do worked perfectly, but it was very straightforward, and I think it was in a good research environment for teaching and mentoring. And so, I loved my PhD. I, I worked, a great deal of hours. I don't want to get into that. I don't think that you have to work so many hours just to be successful, but, it was something that, again, I enjoyed. And I was like, where else am I going to go? I might as well do another experiment. What else am I doing on the weekend? Oh, I'll go into the lab for a couple hours. And, so I was in a really good place, I think, from that kind of teaching and mentoring environment. It wasn't perfect. There was still some drawbacks of the environment and lab that I was in. Um, but as a whole, and even outside, I was living with a great group of friends, and so I had a really good balance, I guess you could say, between kind of work and life. I can come home, have a terrible day in the lab, or just be exhausted, and come home to my friends, and that would change my entire outlook. And I think having kind of that supportive base, and they could care less what I did. They found it was kind of funny with some of the experiments that I actually did do, but they could care less what I did during my day. It was just you were home now, and hey, let's have fun, let's go do this, and that was great. And like part of me still kind of looks back of like, man, I wish I could go do that again. I have a lot more responsibilities now, but no, I mean, I think it was a very positive experience, especially towards the beginning of my PhD. The lab had significant funding, and I had the opportunity to go to several conferences, and even international conferences, and I think that was really instrumental. And I think that there was a lot of opportunity for networking, and just not only with local labs, and it's actually how I met your advisor, Zach. And it's with going to these meetings, you can very quickly put a face to a name where you've kind of read these papers, and pretty soon you can kind of build off of this network. And for better or worse, vector biology is still a growing community, and there's not a lot of people, and so you can really very quickly kind of get a good idea of the lay of the land, kind of make some relationships, and a lot of those are still long lasting, and I still talk to a lot of the people that I first met 20 years ago.
Yeah, this is
And
very important part, and I will share the positive, experience of PhD. People have different, a mixed version of their journeys, and I had the best time of my life during my PhD. That was
yeah,
one thing which I always try to say, that it is just your attitude. Failed experiment will be there, but you have to keep your head up and look at the bigger picture, because what you are working toward is, nobody has done that
yep,
either in the because there is no way in any part of the world that you can do a PhD on something which somebody has already done. There
yep.
has to be a little deviation, some novelty in there. That's how you do that. So coming from PhD and then you move to Johns Hopkins, uh, the reason why you chose Johns Hopkins in the first place, and then on basis on your experience, how you will guide the graduate students, current graduate students all over the world who are listening to this conversation, that what are the things they should look and keep utmost important when they are looking for their postdoctoral journey.
Yeah, and so at least for me, uh, when I was thinking about that transition, I didn't have a clear option. I could have maybe stuck around and continued some of the work. I mean, during my PhD, ultimately the intention was to use transposable elements for gene drive. Um, it turns out they suck. They're not very good at that, and so ultimately a lot of the work that is being now done now with CRISPR Cas9 and kind of other derivatives, these are things that we tried to do 20 years ago.
Mhm.
But the technology allows for that, and while we were able to kind of demonstrate that to some extent that our hypothesis failed, which is a bit of a bummer, but we did the best that we could, and that was unfortunately the system that we dealt with. And there was a lot of additional kind of interest in gene drive at the time, and several labs were doing that. And um, but I kind of wanted to do something more, and I maybe had some nibbles from some of those labs to maybe do a postdoc in. But having kind of really focused on more kind of the genetic modification of mosquitoes, I really wanted to get into some of the more host pathogen interactions and looking more at kind of the infection biology of mosquitoes and all these terrible diseases that they can acquire and transmit. And so I was really interested in either kind of pursuing arboviruses or plasmodium. And there was maybe one option over here, and then the plasmodium option was over there. And late in my PhD, I had been more or less put in contact with Marcelo Jacobs Arena at Hopkins. Um, and unfortunately, there wasn't anything, at the time where there was no funding to support a position. And because of kind of the foundation that I kind of put in place, and kind of having discussions before the position, when something did open it up, he kind of called me out of the blue and was like, "Hey, I got some funding for this that can support you for a couple of years. Would you want to come out here?" And I was like, "Yeah, no, that sounds great." And so, I went out to the lab, um, and admittedly, it wasn't perfect.
Mhm.
I think it had a much different environment than my PhD lab. I think my PhD lab was a lot more kind of supportive. I had a really strong cohort of people, whereas the postdoc, I kind of struggled a little bit because it was the lab itself, at least at that time, I think was very much kind of a sink or swim. You kind of got pushed into the deep end, and you kind of maybe treaded water for a little bit, and you could either start swimming or you drown. And I don't think that that's really the best mentality for a lab. And I think is part of the reason why I was a little slower to get publications from that lab. And I think that looking back, maybe it wasn't the best fit for me, but I think as a whole, uh, I grew into that role. And I think I learned a lot from being put in that situation. and really forced me to think more about my experiments and its outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And if I do this experiment, will it give me this result, and how does that fit into a manuscript? And really trying to think a little bit more kind of a long-term kind of perspective of how to maximize your work. Just not don't just do a bunch of busy work, and think about your writing. And one of the nice things about being at Hopkins is that it does have a lot of resources, and I was able to, and it's got a great reputation in academic environment and all that, and I was actually able to get a postdoc fellowship on my own through NIH that extended my time there, and then later another kind of internal grant. So I was able to fund myself for the most part, and I worked really, I was kind of in isolation in a large lab where each person had their own kind of project, and there wasn't much overlap. So that also was maybe a negative as far as getting, secondary authorships on papers. But, I had a lot of creative freedom, and I can kind of start to develop things on my own. And I think that uh, ultimately a lot of the ideas even that I came up with then started off as being papers or manuscripts or projects in my own lab now. And, some of the initial stuff was really kind of created or synthesized when I was still a postdoc. And so really the later I got in my postdoc, it's like kind of been, a few rounds of, interviews and kind of going through um, different applications. And, I at least had a list of projects and things that I wanted to pursue.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that I had gained a lot of, kind of different training to kind of put me into that next step. And again, continued to kind of network and build the relationships that were there at Hopkins, because one, additional thing too is they had this whole malaria research institute and a large group of people doing different aspects of malaria. And that was really great just for, the learning environment to kind of get you to think outside of just your little niche within that area. And so, I think more than anything, that's, some of the biggest things that I learned from my postdoc experience. And I, ended up making some great relationships when I was there, and some really good friends. But, I think it was having to kind of look at the position a little differently than my PhD. The PhD was easy. You just do this, everything's available. The postdoc, yeah, it worked a little bit harder. And I think really you were in charge of your own destiny, I guess. And a lot of that is, trying to figure out uh, your publications and what that might look like. And I think really kind of forced me to think a little differently than what I had before.
Mm-hmm. So, if we ask that the postdoctoral training paved the path, or like paved the path where you are now, getting the faculty position.
Yeah.
So what you can suggest to our postdocs now, that how they should prepare themselves, whosoever wants to join academia and move to industry, that is, all the two different paths. So what are the things based on their choices they make, how they should prepare themselves to reduce this? Because what has been seen in, and this is probably true for rest of the world also, that the duration of postdoc is going so long these
Mhm.
days that sometimes it stretches like 8, 9 years, 10 years, and some eternal postdocs. So sometimes they say this is the
Yeah.
eternal postdoc. So,
Um, yeah, the longer you're a postdoc, the harder it becomes. There's other things you do in your life. And at least for me, during my postdoc, I met someone when I was out on the East Coast, and we got married, and then we started a family. And with those comes additional responsibilities. And, hey, the postdoc salary isn't all that much. And it created a bit of a crunch financially for us, and especially once you add in childcare costs. And while at the time my goal had always been academia, I was like, oh, this is what I want to do. I want to be a professor, and enjoy this academic life. You also have to kind of be realistic, and it's like, is this going to happen? And trying to explore other opportunities. And at least for me, um, the longer I was around, I still, was committed to uh, finding an academic position. But at the same point in time, I had a friend at the time that had left for industry. And it was kind of it was a government position that was doing lab research. So it was kind of a not a complete jump into industry. It was kind of somewhere in the middle. And I checked that out. I interviewed. I just didn't really get a good vibe. I kind of felt that it wasn't for me. Um, I also had explored becoming a journal editor,
Mhm.
and I actually really liked that aspect and had a really good meeting. This was kind of one of the journals at Still Press, and it was one of those things where I thought I could do it, and I thought I could do it really well. Um, but I didn't really see what that next step would be. It's like, okay, I'm an editor here. What, how does that progress, in my career? And if anything, I think that those were really positive experiences, looking back, and I think it kind of strengthened and kind of validated, no, I really do want to be an academic and kind of follow that path. And so in my own lab and mentoring, I encourage students to kind of pursue whatever path they want and to get those experiences and really test the waters, I guess, before they make that jump. And you know, I've had past students go into government. I've had them go into industry, academic positions. Um, and again, I tried to do my best. Obviously, there's some areas where I'm more familiar and can provide maybe a little more help, but at the same point in time, I definitely try to provide whatever resources I can and help to encourage students to go what are really now the traditional routes and academics. The academic one is I think less prevalent, and I think it's really just trying to have those conversations with people and we probably don't do it as frequent as we should, but in my lab we've done the individual development plans, and I think that can be helpful just to initiate those discussions with people and be like, hey, what do you want to do? What do you see yourself doing? And I think seeing how that changes and especially with students as they first start and over the next few years, or maybe that kind of waffles back and forth until they go to a conference and kind of talk to some other people or and so I think it's really about getting these experiences and really trying to make the best educated decisions that you can. I mean, obviously these are kind of impactful decisions, and you want to follow a path that you can kind of get the most out of. And while sometimes it may not be the most lucrative, sometimes the freedom's way out, or hey, maybe you just want to make more money, and you go down that path. And I think it's really just one of those things where you have to value what's important to you,
Yes.
and whether it's a certain geographic location or if it's truly money. I think trying to prioritize and figuring out what you would really want or what you don't want to do, I think are really important aspects that the individual has to figure that out. And I think just providing additional experiences, I think, is the best that we can do as a mentor.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something which we always say, that you have to see that whatever the choices you are making based on your priorities, because everyone has their different priorities, that where you are the best fit, so that you don't end up stressed yourself, or stressing everyone around you.
Mhm.
We have had people have seen professors, so especially some of the graduate students, when they have these conversations, they always say, My professor always is stressed about this, they are very strict about this." But when they become professor, we have seen this journey, that how much they imbibed from that professor, they never realized that they became one of them. So
Yep.
now, speaking with this, so the mentoring which you got when you were a graduate student, and now when you are mentoring your graduate students, I am not 100% familiar like how it was when the you were a graduate student. People were talking about mental health, work-life balance, and how it has changed over a period of time.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a PhD student, there was no mention of mental health. That was, but again, as I mentioned already, I was personally in a good place, and I think my experience and the support group that I had, was very positive. And so I think it's a little different. And sure, I think, in my mind, I think the biggest push is trying to create, a bit of a net, safety net for students, because there's a lot of bad players out there. There's a lot of people who are toxic in the way that they run these labs, and constantly pushing, harder, 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 and kind of, and that leads to burnout, work-life balance, um, and it leads to, potentially kind of fabricating results, and other things, plagiarism, and all these other things that I think are just, bad. And I think that that's so much more, in our realm of awareness now. And, trying to, sure, everyone's going to struggle with it at times, even myself, it's not always, perfect, and rainbows and unicorns kind of thing. But I mean, I think it's something that is, we are more aware of that. And I think that there's more of a push to create that environment, not only in individual labs, but at departments and across the institution. And I think that there's a lot more awareness of that. And I think that there's a lot more willingness by, other faculty, peers, to help out. And, I think that, oftentimes, if you're not getting certain mentoring experiences, from maybe your direct supervisor, find someone else. And
Yes.
that was something that I did. And, I wasn't necessarily getting direct mentoring, and I sought out additional mentors. And,
Absolutely.
it's like I still have, a peer group of other faculty. It's like, hey, how do you, what happens when this, how do you approach this, and, sure, we're still kind of figuring things out too, and I think, um, having a peer network, and having a support group of, other mentors, and just outside of your immediate bubble, I think is really important. And, I think that's something that, I sought out and I think was incredibly valuable. And, it's still something that, I've tried to keep in existence even now as a faculty member.
Nice. So we had this conversation from you being graduate student, now teaching and mentoring all these brilliant minds. Uh, in all these decades, when you enjoyed the research, what is the one thing which gives you the most content feeling?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a little different now as a PI. I don't admittedly get in the lab very often, and so that idea of discovery is usually something that maybe drove us to work a little harder in the lab and get that result. Um, but for me, my favorite thing is getting that knock on the door. Hey Ryan, I want to show you something. And then it's like you look at these results, or something, and it's like, yeah, that's awesome. It's like I know, and so you kind of live vicariously through the people in your lab. And I think, um, just kind of seeing the work that they can generate, and kind of following through on sometimes projects that have been hanging around for a long time, or have sometimes been problematic, and making that kind of breakthrough, or kind of seeing what these results might look like for the first time, through the lens of other people's projects, I think is really rewarding, and seeing that kind of come to fruition. And to me now, I think it's probably the best thing about being a PI, and seeing that growth, and seeing that excitement in other people.
Absolutely. So you are motivating the other next, or training the next generation of researchers into the field that is accomplishing, fulfilling. Absolutely.
Yeah,
But
no,
now,
totally.
when somebody knocks the door and say that this is not working, as you said, that some experiments just take more and more and more time. So what you can suggest to our early faculties who are going through it, when they have to respond to the funding agency because they have a fund, they have a grant which has to have, you cannot just say that nothing is working. So what you will suggest to them?
Yeah, there's always the funding challenge, which is something else. But I think it's just trying to be realistic with experiments, and sometimes the mindset as a researcher is just you got to keep doing the same thing. Just it'll keep doing this, keep doing this. And I think you have to be really realistic of how you're spending your time and your effort. And in theory, if you're asking the right question, you have the right methodology, it shouldn't take months or years to get the result that you're looking for. And I think learning that, or I think even being realistic about a project, I think is also really important. Where if you're just struggling and nothing is working, sometimes it may be bad luck. It might be just the person's skills don't necessarily align with the needs of the project. And I do think it's important just to try to find ways for success and moving forward, even if it's some small steps of making progress.
Mhm.
And I think it's if it's shifting a project completely, or if it's changing the approach, I think you have to be very realistic about that. And just like, hey, we tried this, we maybe we'll come back to it in a couple of years, or once someone else has some free time. But we just have to move things forward, and because ultimately it kind of gets into the mental health of people. Obviously, if their project isn't working, then why are they continuing to hit their head on a wall? And it's also the success of the people around you is important, because that ultimately comes back to my own. And I want them to succeed so that I can succeed. And uh, I think you have to just be realistic that, hey, as much as you love a project, or you love an idea, you have to kind of uh, separate that from kind of the benefit of, or good of, the lab and the personnel. And I think that that's maybe not always the easiest thing to do. Um, we all kind of have our pet projects, but I think it's actually really important to do that. I think to just for the viability of a research lab. I think that that's critical.
Absolutely. And now this brings us to one of the very crucial point of this conversation, that all these failed experiments are a part of a project which has never been published. And somewhere in another part of the world, somebody's doing the same thing. What are your suggestions that what should be done in these cases when some things are not working? As you said, that when anyone comes with a researcher comes with a hypothesis, they know the possible outcomes. They are not concrete, that's why it is an hypothesis. So when hypothesis fails, what researchers of all the different stages should do and how they should approach it?
Yeah, I think it's a challenging question. Where, I mean, during my postdoc, I remember we used to joke that, oh, this is these experiments are going straight to the Journal of Failed Experiments, and there's not really a venue to, I think, really share when things go bad, or oftentimes the effort outweighs the gain. As far as, hey, we did all this stuff, and most journals are not going to publish that, and but or even if it's to the point of a publication, even if it is a negative result, um, I think it's hard to find a venue for that.
Mhm.
And I think it's important to be transparent. Kind of, hey, this didn't work, but oftentimes those discussions or those results don't make it out to the surface that other people can see. And I think, and it's a kind of unfortunate that there is going to be that level of redundancy, and that redundancy of failure. If I think we need to potentially think of a way in the community of it's just a general kind of like a bioarchive type posting of hey, we tried this, it didn't work,
Yeah.
and subheadings, like I think just integrating social media platforms, I think, is a nice way to have casual conversations with people sometimes, and to kind of post maybe, hey, we tried this, didn't work, or um, I think when it was originally started, things like ResearchGate, I think that was important. I think it's kind of lost some steam. But things like Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it, and just trying to maybe think of a way in which we can actually um, prevent this, lost time and resources by exploring these things. And I don't really have the answer. I mean, it's kind of a challenge that we all face.
I think this is the best way to communicate because, okay, even if it is not a publication, you can share. And sometimes, oftentimes, in fact, it has been observed that a person of a different expertise has the answer that why it did not work. That's where the interdisciplinary research comes in contact. And I think, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, even any lab is still going to have unpublished data that is just going to be kind of sitting in a notebook still. It's like I have an entire chapter from my dissertation that has never seen the light of day, and at this point, it's I don't really care. Um, but I think that any lab is going to have these experiments that even somewhat worked, and they just were never at a point. Maybe someone left the lab, or someone kind of moved on, and they just never got to that point of completion. And um, I think it's important to, as a PI, to try to publish as much as you can, even if it goes into a supplement or whatever. I think it's important to publish and not always be focused on your cell nature science type papers, and sometimes these quick little things in a lower impact journal can be just as valuable. And I think it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and this is something which we always say that every single performed experiment which is not published was never done.
Yep. I mean,
Because,
if it's not published, it was never done.
yeah.
That's the reality.
So now, okay, your thoughts about this, that when faculty, like, are at their different stages, like early faculty, mid-level, and then they become professor and distinguished, how this impact factor changes and how they can be more relaxed and, as you said, realistic about this.
Well, I think, you know, obviously, I think some of the viewpoints are changing as far as impact factor and the importance of publishing in these journals. But the reality is that that's how still a lot of people evaluate your work. And if it's not in one of these top tier journals, whatever, it's crap. I don't want to read it. And so too often for grant applications or fellowship applications or even trying to find a position, that's the easiest way to vet someone. Oh, well, they publish in science. Well, I've seen a lot of really crappy science papers.
Mhm.
And I think that we're more aware of this, but I think it's always um, that challenge to kind of go up against that impact factor bias or whatever you want to call it. Just even the number of publications. There's a lot of kind of people or bean counters out there, and just oh, well, you published 500 papers. You have to be the best person. Well, they all could be really low impact and not the best scientifically. And so I think it's ultimately a balance. And I think it's, especially when I started, I wanted to try to get papers out of the lab just to kind of demonstrate, hey, I can run a research lab, and we can actually publish now. I don't need someone else to look over my shoulder. I can actually do this. And I think that that's a really important aspect when you are first starting off as an assistant professor.
Mhm.
Um, and now, it's weird to say that I'm kind of mid-career, and I'm not even that far off from kind of even going up to full professor. But um, I think we're at a point in the lab now where maybe taking a little bit more time on a paper, and trying to add a little bit more rigor, a little bit more experiments where maybe in the past you know we tried to push a little earlier, or just thinking about it from a little bit larger perspective. I think is kind of the progression in the lab. Don't get me wrong. I mean, we still have those kind of quick little studies that are still going to get out, and they're still going to be kind of lower impact things. But I think ultimately, for me, it's just trying to get papers out that are going to be in a respectable journal, preferably open access, where we can share and disseminate our work as best as possible. And um, I'd like to still encourage people to read a paper before judging it. It seems pretty basic, but I'm guilty of it too. I think that we all are, and I think that there's more importance on really the quality and the rigor of the work than just the impact factor alone. And
Absolutely. And
and
I think you mentioned it so clearly that the balance has to be maintained at all the stages. Either you're a PhD student or you are a professor or
Yeah,
emeritus.
I mean, it's, if you're going up for tenure or you're looking for a job, if you have one science paper or one cell paper, then cool, that's great, but that's not really demonstrating, what you can do as a scientist. And I think it's important to have that balance. And hey, I published 10 papers. Sure, one of them was science, but we're doing a lot of other great work too. And it may not always be at that level, and that's okay because I think, I think oftentimes for especially mosquito work, I think usually the closer you are to humans in your work, the more usually the higher impact type journals it becomes. And so, it can be a really important study or, something that you're really proud of, but, ultimately it's just not going to be a science paper. And, I think it's still work that you could be proud of, but it's just never going to get there. It's never going to get into those journals.
Yeah. So now, keeping like we are at the edge of the conversation, what we ask at this point of time is the word of wisdom. So, what you suggest to all the researchers?
Yeah, no, I perseverance, perseverance, and perseverance, and it's something that, even currently, I mean, it's uh you have to really just persevere and but I don't want to say you don't want to do it blindly. I think you have to be a realistic of, okay, this is where I'm going. Um, it may not be the easiest path. What are my other options? And always kind of looking around. Um, but oftentimes with science, you deal with rejection all the time. And, you can have a day just to kind of be pissed or to take a break, but the next day you just have to get back on and do it again and resubmit or and whether that be a paper or a grant or whatever it may be, that's you just have to keep going. And whether it be from just a failed experiment, to running a lab, I think it's just that mentality is absolutely essential. And just you may get knocked down, but you have to get right back up. And the faster you can do that and kind of brush off the emotions, I think the better. And I think obviously you don't want to do that blindly though. I think you really have to be cognizant of what is in your best interest. But sometimes it's just going to take a long time.
Yeah.
And, hopefully you can still get to where you want to be.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. N. At this point, we always tell to our audience, whosoever watching this, that they can either write to you or they can write Empowering Science Foundation to put them in touch with the researchers of their choice. And we do host a mentor-mentee program where if they have direct question or they need mentoring one-to-one, it's like if it is possible, so that they can do what they want to, they are passionate about, and they should enjoy it. They just need some directions. We are there to help.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no, that sounds great. I'm happy to help.
It was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Roger.